So I'm just happy to be here, honored that Jennifer would ask me to read for pagination. Tonight, I'm going to share with you uh, chapter 9, some of chapter 9 in the book, which is about resisting racism. And that chapter is called Hopeful Eyes on a Hopeless Issue. I want to talk to Thomas Merton about race. One might doubt whether a cloistered white man who lived in Kentucky in the middle of the last century would have anything useful to offer. But this particular monk knew that such a conversation is never about race alone. Talking about race means, among many things, sharing our fears and frustrations about our place in the world, about how people are treated, about a hope for better opportunities that never seem to materialize. In other words, it's about dignity, respect, a shared humanity, and ultimately our hearts and souls. Racism is not just about white people treating people of color badly. It is about how the repercussions of that treatment reverberate for everyone to the detriment of us all. There is something so intuitive about Merton's views that I think talking to him about race would be helpful. I have a hunch that he, unlike many white people, would be willing to go to the heart of the matter in a way that doesn't focus on him. Merton moved to the United States in the late 1930s when African Americans were referred to as Negroes, and segregation was a fact of life. His own position, that of a young white man and a Columbia University student, was a privileged one that would have allowed him, if he chose, to ignore the injustice and inequality imposed on people of color. But somehow he was able to look at race and say quite coherently that something was very wrong. When he was a teacher at St. Bonaventure's College in Allegheny, New York, he met Catherine DeHook, who visited the school to speak about the conditions in Harlem and the community center she ran there, Friendship House. Merton asked her afterward if he could come to Harlem and volunteer. She agreed, and he arrived via subway on a rain-soaked, humid day in August 1941. His impression of Harlem affected him so deeply that he would recall it with stunning power years later in The Seven-Story Mountain. He wrote, "Here in this huge, dark, steaming slum, hundreds of thousands of Negroes are herded together like cattle, most of them with nothing to eat and nothing to do. All the senses and imagination and sensibilities and emotions and sorrows and desires and hopes and ideas of a race with vivid feelings and deep emotional reactions are forced in upon themselves, bound inward by an iron ring of frustration. The prejudice that hems them in with its four insurmountable walls. In this huge cauldron, inestimable natural gifts, wisdom, love, music, science, poetry are stamped down and left to boil with the dregs of an elementary corrupted nature. And thousands upon thousands of souls are destroyed by vice and misery and degradation, obliterated, wiped out, washed from the register of the living, dehumanized. Harlem is there by way of a divine indictment against New York City and the people who live downtown and make their money downtown. The brothels of Harlem and all its prostitution and its dope rings and all the rest are the mirror of the polite divorces and the manifold cultured adulteries of Park Avenue. They are God's commentary on the whole of our society." Merton returned many times to Friendship House. He looked after children, led prayer services, sorted through clothing donations. He thought seriously of making Friendship House his own life's work and went back and forth trying to decide whether to live in poverty serving God in Harlem or to live in poverty serving God as a monk in Kentucky. He eventually chose the cloistered existence. Once he entered the monastery, Merton wrote little about race, but those pages in his autobiography were enough for the leaders of the civil rights movement to mark him as an ally. When he took up the subject again years later, as the civil rights movement gained steam, Merton came to the table with credibility. In 2019, Gregory K. Hillis of Bellarmine University, which houses the Merton Center, summarized Merton's 1963 essay, The Black Revolution, Letters to a White Liberal. Overarching the entire essay is Merton's conviction that the oppression of African Americans is systemic and that white liberals, A, do not know enough to fight against the racism baked into American society, and B, are in fact guilty of propping up this racist system for their own well-being. In the same article, Hillis quotes a young man who said he carried one of Merton's books in his pocket when crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma in 1965, and a Black woman who said she, quote, felt alienated by her church and religious community for her civil rights work in the 1960s, unquote. But that, quote, Merton got it when few others did, unquote. Eldridge Cleaver, an early leader of the Black Panther Party, notes in his autobiography, Soul on Ice, how he would often reread Merton's Harlem pages whenever he felt his resolve weakening. The passages helped him, he said, to become once more a rigid flame of indignation. Sounds like I've come to the right monk for this conversation. Yet, I don't want to be a rigid flame of indignation. I don't want my life weighed down by anger, hopelessness, and resentment. How do I do that, Thomas? I have a biracial teenage son. Tane has a strong faith and a sunny disposition that makes him look for and see the best in all he beholds. When he was about 8 or 9 and decided to don a black choir robe, a cross, and a purple stole in order to be Martin Luther King Jr. for our church's All Saints Day procession, he told me why. King was a great leader and helped Black people have better lives. I was so proud of him, but I also knew I had to guide him. Despite appearances, including the Black president who was in office for most of Tane's young life, King's fight is not over. Tane is growing up in a time when it's not uncommon to see videos on the internet and the evening news of unarmed Black people being shot and killed. I feel the need to affirm his attitude, but I also have to be real with him. I don't want Tane to become fearful and angry, but he also has to be aware, now that he's grown lanky and well past the 6-foot mark, of how others may view him. He has fair skin, dark brown eyes, and a few freckles sprinkled over his cheeks. His dark brown hair, once worn short and close cropped, is now long and curly, topping his head like a soft cloud. It's the hair we often talk about. Tane needs to understand the possible effects of having such hair. We look at images on television and in magazines and discuss how African Americans are portrayed. I remind him to pull back the hood of his jacket from his head when he walks into a store. I showed him footage of NFL player Michael Bennett being apprehended during an active shooting situation simply because, being tall and Black, he stood out as a threat. When Tane learns to drive, I will teach him how to behave during a police stop, how to keep his hands in view and make no sudden moves. I still think about the 2015 video showing a Black man, Walter Scott, who had been stopped for a traffic violation, being gunned down by a police officer. Scott is running away when the white officer fires 8 shots at his back. Scott falls face down, and the officer handcuffs him that way. The officer does not check to see if he is breathing. He does not turn him over. He tosses a taser near the man's body. Later, he claimed that Scott had tried to take it from him. Scott received no assistance, not even from the Black officer who later arrives on the scene. Scott dies at the scene. The coroner later said that Scott was struck 5 times. He was unarmed. Discussing the video with a friend, we talk about the shock of witnessing the killing, of watching Walter Scott fall, and of the bitter taste in our mouths after seeing him hit the ground. What really leaves our souls scorched and grieving is the casual behavior of the police officer who fired the weapon. It's as though this event was not extraordinary for him, as though he had no sense of the impact of his action, that he had ripped a precious life from the world. It is this sense of my soul being scorched that I need to heal, Thomas. I don't want to pass it on to my son. In 1963, Merton met a young Black priest, August Thompson, who visited Gethsemane from his home parish in Alexandria, Louisiana. A few months later, Thompson wrote to Merton for guidance after being berated by his bishop for speaking out on the poor treatment of Black people in the Catholic Church. How they could only receive communion after whites had already received it. How white Catholics would rather pay someone to drive a Black Catholic to another town for church than have the person attend in their parish. How Thompson himself was prohibited from saying Mass at white parishes, and how some white Catholics refused to call him father. The church had betrayed its Black congregants and all notions of Christian love by only giving them more of what they experienced daily in the secular world. It's striking to me that the advice you gave him, Thomas, appealed to the priest's loving heart and not his indignant mind. You instructed him to handle his bishop's disapproval with compassion. Quote, "You have to take into account the absolute blindness and absolute self-righteousness of people who have been schooled by centuries of prejudice and injustice to see things their way and no other," unquote. To tell you the truth, Thomas, I would have taken this as a condescending word from an out-of-touch white monk. It sounds too much like the white moderates of the day. Be patient. Don't ask for too much. Change happens slowly. But I realize I need to be patient with the words in your response and understand that what you were trying to do for Thompson is what I need to do for myself. You wanted him to take care of his heart first. If he kept bashing himself against the stone wall of the bishop's blind racism, it would only lead to disillusionment and then anger and pain. But if he led with a loving heart, he could instead seep into the stone, like water trickling down a mountain, and eventually crack the mountain open from within, all without compromising his own emotional health. You sought to teach Thompson the essence of nonviolence. Having studied Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent protest, you read and taught to your novices King's letters from a Birmingham jail. You learned that nonviolence is not only a way of protest, but a way of being. That if one is careless in thoughts and words, one can be violent without realizing it. Quote, "Where minds are full of hatred and where imaginations dwell on cruelty, torment, punishment, revenge, and death, then inevitably there will be violence and death," you wrote. This tells me that if I want to escape anger and hopelessness, my focus shouldn't be on the wrongs being done. I have to begin with my humanity. I could be ruled by what I see, the ongoing occurrences of racism and hate crimes and the long shadow of police shootings of unarmed Black men. In order to release the power of these instances over my mind and heart, it is imperative that I unravel some of the complicated threads within myself. The writer Robert Vivian once lectured on how we all have immortal wounds, events in our lives we simply cannot get over. James Baldwin never got over his stepfather's ruthless abuse or the racism that made him leave the US to live in Europe. These wounds showed up in everything he wrote. Vivian suggested that if we understood our wounds, we would understand what makes our writing unique. My wound is betrayal. And the betrayal wasn't even my own. I was 11 years old when the miniseries Roots aired on television. I was fascinated by the friendship between the enslaved girl Kizzy and the slave owner's daughter, Missy Ann. Missy Ann teaches Kizzy how to read. And maybe this was the source of my fascination because I loved to read. I didn't understand, though, how this went against the law of the time and how dire the consequences were. After Kizzy writes a note for a slave trying to escape, her skill is discovered and she is sold. She is put on a cart, and as her new owner prepares to haul her away, Kizzy is screaming for Missy Ann. I kept waiting for Missy Ann to appear, to say something, if only goodbye to her friend. When she didn't come, I assumed she wasn't at home or had been put someplace in the house where she couldn't hear Kizzy. But then the scene cuts to Missy Ann sitting calmly despite the screams. She coolly observes how stupid Kizzy has been. And that's it. I couldn't believe the betrayal, the bonds of friendship torn asunder. I wondered if the bond had even been real in the first place. Betrayals, to me anyway, are about people who are supposed to know you, yet intentionally put you in a place of having to be something other than yourself. Maybe I'm careful now only to allow people close to me who are unlikely to harbor betrayal, as if I can really tell. But that doesn't mean the wound is not at work within me. In 2015, my brother's home in Florida was spray painted with a racist threat. I posted a photo on social media of the ugly Black lettering dripping down the side of his house. I wanted people to know racism was active and affecting someone they knew. One friend started a GoFundMe campaign to raise funds to have my brother's house painted, a campaign that ended up earning more than the goal amount. But a good number of my white friends were simply stunned. They were surprised that this kind of thing still happens, and they shared the post with equal amounts of shock and horror. The Black Lives Matter movement was already going strong at that point. The spray painting happened just weeks after a young white man, Dylan Roof, shot and killed 9 African Americans during a prayer group at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. I wanted to ask, what country are you living in? I thought they should know better. It may not be a betrayal, but it feels awfully close. Asking what country are you living in doesn't help. It's essentially resentment, not compassion. It's this kind of thinking Merton wanted August Thompson to avoid when he advised him about his bishop. If he could focus on nonviolence instead, then Thompson had a better chance of achieving something greater. Hillis describes it as calling Thompson to work for his bishop's conversion. White religious leaders need to be converted too, a lesson we continue to learn. Merton says that the purpose of nonviolent conversation is to, quote, awaken the conscience of the white man to the awful reality of his injustice, so that he will be able to see that the Negro problem is really a white problem, that the cancer of injustice and hate, which is eating white society and is only partly manifested in racial segregation with all its consequences, is rooted in the heart of the white man himself, unquote. Thomas, are you telling me that the race issue is really an issue of faith? I'm willing to explore that. But the dialogue I've experienced, to my frustration, hasn't gone anywhere near an awakening of conscience. When I participated in conversations at the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, and I mean not this year, I mean back in 2015, we never seemed to get to a discussion of the current situation. The people who participated, most of them white, preferred to speak instead about what was, how they had participated in the civil rights movement, how they had attended protests and rallies, and how, yes, the Jim Crow era was terrible, but compared to that, things are so much better now. As well-meaning as they were, their words eventually began to sound like the trope, I have Black friends. What do I want to hear instead? I guess something along these lines, which you, Thomas, wrote in 1967. I face the fact that I am living in an immoral, blind, even in some sense criminal society, which is hypocritical, bloated, self-righteous, and unable to see its true condition. By and large, the people are nice as long as they are not disturbed in their comfortable and complacent lives. They cannot see the price of their respectability. And I am part of it, and I don't know what to do about it, apart from symbolic and futile gestures. If I heard that, Thomas, I think I would respond, I don't know what to do either. But the fact that we're here in this same place of not knowing is a really good place to start. From there, we could look at the bigger picture and also challenge ourselves as individuals to make change from within. We are called, you wrote, to be like the child in the fairy tale, The Emperor's New Clothes, willing to upset the conditions of our comfortable existence. Quote, our vocation as innocent bystanders and the very condition of our terrible innocence is to do what the child did and keep on saying the king is naked at the cost of being condemned criminals, unquote. If we don't become the truth tellers, then a different kind of erosion can happen in which resentment breeds, a resentment that would threaten the wholeness of my heart and soul. If nothing else, I must be whole and respond to racism in a way that is true to the depths of my being. What does that look like? We're getting on the same page, I think, Thomas, because something else you observed gives me hope. You wrote, these Negroes are not simply judging the white man and rejecting him. On the contrary, they are seeking by Christian love and sacrifice to redeem him, to enlighten him, so as not only to save his soul from perdition, but also to awaken his mind and his conscience. Redemption. Yes, My friend and neighbor, Jane, she lives down the street from me. Jane, after reading my first novel, a story about a family dealing with drug addiction, said that I seemed to be all about redemption. She added, "You don't throw people away." I suppose redemption works in me so deeply that I don't always recognize when I'm doing it. I'm drafting a novel about an enslaved girl of mixed race and a white girl. They are half sisters who share a father, a slave owner. As I work my way through figuring out the plot, developing the characters, and considering their actions, it occurred to me that yet again, I have Kizzy and Missy Ann on my mind. I am seeking to redeem Missy Ann, writing still from this immortal wound. As I read over my pages and see how I'm righting wrongs in my fictional worlds, I see how I am accessing compassion. And because I can access it, I can offer and model it for my son. In turn, he supports my hope. Already, he's showing me the possibilities. I drive him 45 minutes to school, and depending on traffic, nearly an hour home each day so that he can attend an arts high school in an urban area. He studies theater and enjoys a more diverse environment in terms of race, class, and sexual orientation than we have here where we live. He and his friends are so accepting of each other that even if they don't know someone's gender, they don't ask. They only care about the person, what their name is, the activities they favor, how they are doing on any given day. I think this attitude blossoming throughout Taine's generation and the generations to come, it makes me feel an abundance of hope. Thank you.
Yeah, and Lisa is writing in the chat, brilliant. My words exactly. And I actually wrote you a question about this chapter, and I think that all the quotes that I pulled out you read. uh, but when I was going to ask you about it, because in creative nonfiction writing classes and books, you sometimes hear as a student, as a writer, wait until such and such experience is over for a while and then write it. You hear this advice of give something space before you sit down to write. But as you say in this chapter, there are things that you can't just put away. These issues are ongoing. You live in that chaos. And so if you were waiting to write until it was over, you would never write it. And so so I'm curious to what advice you would give to writers who are writing in the thick of something.
Yeah.
And how do you write in that swirl of emotion, or as you say, unraveling the complicated threads within yourself while it's happening around you?
Yeah, I feel that there are two levels of writing. So in the thick of it, when the thing happens, right? Sandy Hook shootings, as you know, that's part of my tapestry. Um, uh, the death of my friend Katie. It's like I have no idea what this is going to mean, and I couldn't write coherently about Sandy Hook for at least 3 years, but I did write something in the moment, right? It was incoherent um, but when I could write about it eventually, I was grateful for that early writing, if only for myself, because it had the detail. It had the detail, it also had the raw emotion, which would have softened, right, over the years. Um, so sometimes writing in the moment, you might be able to come up with something coherent. So when my friend Katie died, I felt like I didn't want to lose any aspect of her, and I was grabbing on like this, and I knew I was going to write something in the moment because I wanted to hold on to that grief. and I knew the freshness of this grief, and I wanted to express it. So I was able to communicate that. At some point, I'll probably write another thing about Katie, but I'm still processing that loss. So I think it's being aware of these two different types of writing, and to look at what you've written in the moment, and also to come back to it later, but to be aware and let yourself know that these are two types of things, and to not think, oh, I can't write about this right now, or I have to let it sit, but to be aware that that you have different opportunities. It's not like you're going to write one thing once and say, okay, that's it, right? You'll write about something again and again. So give yourself the opportunity, but don't miss those moments in the moment to at least capture some words. I don't know about you, but I journaled a lot in the early days of the pandemic last year, and I have no idea if I'm ever going to write about it, but I knew I was in a specific moment, and I wanted to capture what I felt then.
That makes so much sense to me, and it's encouraging, because yeah, it gives us permission to sort of be generous with our writing. And you write about this quite a bit in terms of thinking, and you write about this in the chapter on ambition too, of really reframing our thoughts about writing from product to process. And I love that you do that in a book that is a conversation with someone's journals, rather than sort of his more famous works. One thing that you mentioned when you answered that made me want to ask you about this is another piece of advice that sometimes students will tell me they've heard, or an anxiety that they sort of think to themselves, which is you only get one essay on something, right? That somehow you have one shot to write about this relationship, or one time, to write about that, and it becomes so much pressure that you just end up not writing about it because it's so big. How do you approach coming to an event or coming to a topic again and again in your writing?
Yeah, actually, I found that was one of the things that kept me stuck about this writing about Sandy Hook, is that I thought I had to write the Sandy Hook essay, right? That it had to encompass a lot of different things, and it wasn't until after the Charleston shootings, right? The Charleston shootings happened, and Roxane Gay wrote a piece that was in the New York Times about why I can't forgive Dylan Roof, and it was shared all over. I saw it in my social media. My friends on Facebook were sharing it again and again, and I kept waiting for someone to take the opposite tact and say, well, forgiveness, there needs to be forgiveness here, and forgiveness is important. And nobody was doing it. And it bugged me to the point where I got up one morning and I could hear one of my writing teachers in my head saying, don't get too preachy, Scott, because I knew I was going to sit down and write something. And I wrote about an essay about forgiveness, and it was connected to Sandy Hook and Charleston. And that opened the door for me, because I realized that there was more than one essay that I could write, that I didn't have to write this huge essay. So this essay is about forgiveness. I have a Sandy Hook essay that is about what I learned from watching my son grieve. There's an essay about why I didn't go to the firehouse and to the school, like in those early moments after the shooting. So so I could really break it down. And when I looked at that, it was somehow more accessible to me to know that I could write more than one thing.
Yeah, and I love hearing that, because it gives us permission to revisit, and you write about it also in this book too. And yeah, I feel like this essay is in conversation with that essay, Why I Didn't Go to the Firehouse, which is in Love's Long Line, if you're looking for a copy of that essay. Yeah, and I have a few more questions, but I did want to invite attendees to, if you go down to the bottom of your screen, to encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A section. So if you do have questions, people in the webinar, please feel free to share those in the Q&A session. I can pass those along to Sophronia. I have many questions about this book, which is so multifaceted. It covers just such a huge swath of topics. And they all intersect because they're all based on your faith and its relationship to all these different things. One thing that stuck out to me as I was reading, because I am a fan of your writing so much, as I noticed the style of the essays. And so, for example, in Love's Long Line, which is a collection I have read several times, um, I noticed that it's more lyrical. You have more experiments in form, maybe. In The Seeker and the Monk, there's one passage that I just absolutely loved. It's on page 60, and it's right after you are walking, and you're describing feeling close to the earth. I'm just going to read it because it's really lyric and it's short. I feel closest to the earth after the rain. The ground is so soft, and as I walk it, I have this sense of coming home, like I want to lie down in the forest after a warm spring rain, only instead of lying on the earth. I have become the earth, alive and wet and teeming. Flowers could germinate beneath me and grow roots and tendrils through my body until they come from my skin and bloom and bloom and bloom through my mouth and from every square inch of my being. The feeling is exhilarating and devastating, sublime. I mean, that passage just took my breath away. There are like moments of that kind of lyric writing that really stand out to me in the book. I was curious to just from a craft standpoint, so certain passages, as we heard in what you just gave in the reading, you're sort of referring to Merton in third, and then sometimes you switch the approach to point of view and you address Merton directly in a stylized monologue. And I noticed that often when you make that move, it's usually at the end of a chapter. It's maybe one declarative line at the end of a long passage, almost as a punctuation to a point that you're making, or you'll often direct a question that will then inspire more meditation. I was curious how you came about balancing that approach. It would have been maybe an obvious choice to just direct the whole book to Merton, but I think that mixing it is so much better. But how did you make that decision of when to direct him directly and when to sort of write in this kind of separate space where you're not directing the narration at him?
I have my editor was tremendous, Valerie Weaver-Zerker, and she made me aware of two things. Number one, that that when in the early drafts of this, she's like, you keep speaking as though people know who Merton is. And most people don't, which is why another reason that this book is needed. So there's that. And also, you don't want to leave the reader out. So you don't want the conversation to become too insular. So, and it was also her idea that we try to do like a biography of Merton. And when she said that, that gave me a sense of, okay, now I know how to order these chapters, because I didn't know. I was like, oh, we can have the chapters can follow his biography, and I know exactly how we can do this now. But so that's why you have that combination, because I'm informing the reader about Merton, right? So telling about his life and all of that, and being very careful when I switch over and speak to him, because I wanted that intimacy, but I also didn't want to close out the reader. I didn't want you to not be able to feel you were part of the conversation.
I love that explanation. And I mean, to me, that I just was watching it, as a reader and as a writer, thinking these moves are so perfect. I just really admired the structure of the book. And then, moving through to have the last chapter be about his death and also your own meditation on death and the ways to think about it. It just worked. I mean, I thought this is a stunning structure. I mean, the closer was so resonant. I want to share a question from Sujash Purna, who's actually one of our graduate students at Missouri State University. And he writes, "Thank you so much for the powerful words. The wounds in us make us know ourselves as writers, and the wound of betrayal is addressed so well in your book. How do you navigate the tricky waters between writing what matters and a white liberal audience that never experienced racism or the pain that it creates to the people of color and may even get offended?"
I don't quite understand that question. I'm sorry. How do I do what?
So how do you navigate the tricky waters between writing what matters and a white liberal audience that never experienced racism and the pain it creates to the people of color and who may get offended by what you write? So maybe the tricky waters of writing what you need to write, but also worrying maybe about offending a particular audience in writing that.
I can only write what I'm going to write. And I'm on a certain level, I'm sorry, I actually, I don't want to say, I don't care.
I think that's a great answer.
I have to write what I'm going to write. And one of the things I learned very early on, actually, this was even with my first novel, is that you can't control how people are going to read things. And you will turn yourselves inside out if you try. People will read themselves into your novel. One of my brothers, I have two brothers, and one of the brothers in the novel is sort of modeled after my oldest brother, but my second brother just swore up and down that I was writing about him. Right? So you can't control that. So I really don't. I can't waste the brain space. I can only write what I'm going to write, and come what may, because people are going to have their reaction. And it's right for them to have their reactions. I can't, people are going to get offended one way or another, right? So, and you have to allow them to have those emotions. Maybe we can learn from that. So why are you offended? What is going on there with this? Maybe you can open something up and challenge someone on that level.
Oh, thank you. Lise, yeah. And Sujesh, thank you for that question. Yeah, I love that. Come what may, and yes, that maybe is part of the work of the literature. Yeah. Lisa in the chat asks, as the seeker, did you find what you were searching for, and what was it?
Oh, seeking is an ongoing journey, right? The spiritual path is ongoing. So the seeking is about many things. It is about, like in the piece that I just read, it's about, how do I protect my heart and still engage in the world, in looking at addressing racism? How do I stay close to God? How do I bring back energy for my faith when my faith is tired, right? Ongoing, it's ongoing. So I am a seeker. So no, I'm in certain levels, yeah, there were things I find, right? So that conversation with Merton on racism helped me figure out how to engage with this particular topic. Other things will be ongoing, like, making peace with death.
Yeah, and that kind of actually, Lisa, connects with a question that I asked. So there's one section in the book that talks about the notion, or the feeling called acedia. And acedia is defined as the listlessness or boredom often connected to spirituality. And in the book, you write about, these chapters in the journals where Thomas Merton is thinking, oh, I need to move to Mexico. I need to go somewhere else. If only I went somewhere else, I would be divinely inspired. And, it's so relatable. And you talk about how relatable that is to you and your own times in your life that, you feel acedia, and how it's part of the human condition and part of the seeking. Yeah. You write that your solution is threefold: to pray, exercise, and write. And then the section following that discusses how, when you are involved in those activities and you're not in acedia, that when you have those things that are feeding you, it feels like light. It feels like being in a light. I've heard from so many writers this past year about, and people, not just writers, I tend to talk to a lot of writers, but that, this year with everything going on, there's been a lot of feelings of acedia. We've named it different things. We've named it, pandemic fog, pandemic brain, this listlessness and seeking, and people are sort of acting on it, or it's hurting mental health. I was curious, I look at your work, creating this book, you're writing this within this time, you're traveling to the monastery in this time. What advice would you give to people, readers, or writers who are suffering from acedia, and maybe a way that you have found that works to kind of move out of that?
Mm.
That's a
Uh,
big question, I realize.
no, I think that when we hit patches like that, we think that we need to just grind our way through it, right? Just keep going. When really that may not be what you need. You might need to stop and do something else. It might be that you need a day to veg in front of the TV and watch An Officer and a Gentleman 6 times or something, right? But you have to let yourself rest and recover, right? And then gently work your way out of it, right? It's almost like, you know, a wound, like you've had surgery, right? And you're not expected to, like, okay, I've had surgery, I'm just gonna go back out and be working 12 hours a day and all of this. No, you have to rest and you have to recover, and your body's forced to do that. So I think you have to uh, make that space, even if it means not writing, because sometimes you have to take a break from writing, right? To allow yourself, and then, but to figure out what will fill you up again, what will give you some delight, right? Maybe it will be discovering a different kind of music. Maybe it will be, you know, the first time you get to go to a museum again after all of this. But what would fill you with delight, and go do that thing?
Yeah, thank you for that. And yeah, I'm sort of seeing some people even come into the shop and tell us that it's their first visit to a store in a year. And just that feeling that we sort of share in that moment of like the thrill and the joy and the delight. I mean, that's the perfect word for it. The delight of that feeling. Yeah, I think I appreciate you saying that, because I remember you reminded me of Mary Ruefle, who came to River Pretty, and during her talk, she gave a talk on fallow periods and thinking about our lives as periods where we bear fruit and periods where we are fallow, and to respect that. And I think this kind of connects to your different chapters on sort of consumer culture and also ambition, where it's sort of seen as a moral failing to not be producing.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And sort of thinking about our relationships with that and being really mindful and checking ourselves so we don't get in that downward spiral. I have one more question, and then there's also a question in the webinar. So you write in the book, I offer my Merton image so he may be available to someone else who will then craft their own. And I love that. I was wondering, are there other figures who have been offered to you in this way? And if so, who have they been? And maybe if you can speak to some other models of this approach that you might recommend to readers who are really engaged with this style of writing. You mentioned many writers that you admire in the book. You quote Rumi quite a bit. You mentioned, of course, other writers of faith like Barbara Brown Taylor, who wrote the foreword to the book, and then also our beloved Robert Vivian, who you quoted in your reading as well. But yeah, I'm curious, what other figures have been offered to you in the way that you are offering us Thomas Merton?
Well, first of all, you have to understand the way this book came about. It wasn't intentional that I was, oh, you know, going to write this book about Merton. It came about because I was on a panel talking about Merton and the way I have this monk who follows me around, and how I this is the way I engage with his work. And it surprised me by how many people were interested in that. And I realized that they were looking for a way into Merton that wasn't academic, that wasn't theological. And I realized, oh, I guess I have something to offer there. And so basically I'm modeling that. So that's why I was saying that, okay, this is how I did it. But my Merton doesn't have to be your Merton. And so I'm hoping to open a door for people to engage with his work. So which can be pretty tough. So I'm that's why I'm glad I put have the biography pieces in there so that people can understand who he was, and to come at his writing with a start, right? That it's not so heavy. Um, Other writers, this was an unusual engagement, right? To be in conversation in my head with someone like this. And I don't know if it would happen on this level again. But I was reading a devotional over, I guess it was last year, and this devotional has quotes from different people across years. And I noticed that this one name kept coming up in the book, and that the things that man said sort of like kept ringing a bell. And I was like, wow, yeah, that's interesting. Wow, who is this? Who is this Howard Thurman guy? Right. And so I've recently just, now I'm learning about Howard Thurman, who I did not know was Black, and all of these other things about him. And it seems like, okay, this is another person. Like he and I, whereas I have nothing in common with Merton, I feel like this guy, I do. We seem to think the same way about a lot of things. So I have no idea where that's going to go. But it is about being in conversation and understanding that, and maybe part of the reason why I'm so fascinated with Merton is that there are conversations I I I want to have that I can't always have in real life, right? So if Robert Vivian lived next door to me, we'd be sitting out at the fire pit all day having these conversations. But I don't have that. So I engage with other writing in this way. So it's possible for other people to do that.
Well, I love that. And maybe, yeah, maybe someone will read the book and think, I really wanted to engage in a conversation with this historical figure. And yeah, it'll just, yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about maybe the book, my autobiography of Carson McCullers is one that comes to mind that's really engaging and interesting. But I just was so energized by the forum. I love that it came sort of in an unexpected way after this panel. And I noticed in the acknowledgments, you said that part of the writing of the book came from someone who came up to you after the workshop and said, so when will we see your Thomas Merton book? And you didn't know until that moment that you had a Thomas Merton book. So that was really striking to me when I read that in the acknowledgments.
Yeah, it's like, wow. And I know
Yeah.
it'll be my Thomas Merton book, that I can do a Merton book that's
Yeah.
not already out there, and all of the other, so many Thomas Merton books. But
Yeah.
when you think about it, Jen, we already have conversations with the things that we read, right? We
Mm-hmm.
talk back to books all the time. Like you're reading something, you're like, oh, I can't believe he said that.
Totally.
We do that. And
Yeah.
so I'm just putting on paper something that all of us already do. This is not something special. I'm just bringing in awareness to it.
Well, I love it. And it feels very special to me to read. I'm going to share a question from the chat from an attendee who asks, and actually there is a whole essay in the collection that covers this topic. So how quickly you can answer it, because it's a pretty big question. How do you balance your hurt and anger related to injustice with the value and ways of nonviolence?
Read that again, please, because this is what I just read, in fact.
Yes, yeah, and that chapter keeps going, where you really get talk deeply about this and sort of your views of what activism means to you as a writer.
Yeah.
But the question is, how do you balance your hurt and anger related to injustice with the value and ways of nonviolence?
Okay, so I will give you an example. First of all, it's about feeling the hurt and anger, but then not focusing on it, right? It's about, okay, hurt, anger, but now let's look at what's going on here, right? So, and some of you may know that on Friday mornings, I do these like 5-minute videos called your morning walk with Sophronia. And I'm usually talking about writing, but often I'm also talking about what's on my mind, about what's going on. And the video that I did after the insurrection on January 6th, a lot of people have spoken to me about that video, because there was a lot of upset after that. Of course, there was a lot of anger, there was a lot of hate. And I said that but in order to come away from this, we have to look at the people doing these things from a very, speaking to their humanity, from our humanity, right? And I said, you know, like that guy who was sitting in Nancy Pelosi's office with his feet up on the desk, right? When I looked at that picture, I said, okay, this is someone who must not have very much power in his life. This is probably the most powerful he has ever felt in his life. And I feel sorry for this man. When he talked about taking that letter from her desk and saying, and I left a quarter or something like that, and she's not worth that much. And I said, okay, here's a man who sees people's lives in terms of a monetary value. And I bet he doesn't see himself, he knows that he probably doesn't see himself as being worth all that much. Right. So this puts me in a place of compassion. And if I were to address this person in person, I would, and it would probably be hard, but I would have to come from that compassion, right, to have a conversation. And then it becomes a conversation. It's not just us yelling at each other because you know, you're bad and I'm this and all that, right? There has to be a place to start. I've had, you know, I spoke in the piece about conversations with my son. We had more conversations last summer after George Floyd, and speaking about police, behaving around police. And he said to me, but Mama, this has not been my experience of police. Now, you know, my son was in 3rd grade on the day of Sandy Hook, right? He was in that school. Most of his school life, he has lived with police on the scene. They are in the driveway. They are the first, often first person he would see walking into the school would be a police officer, right? High-fiving him, right? Police protected him. Police lived down the street. Police were a loving, safe presence for him. So I'm not going to make him say, well, you can't think that anymore. Right. So I have to offer him the whole picture and even the possibility. I said to him, I said, you know, Tane, this could be the source of your nonviolence, right? You and your friends out and maybe, you know, something that could become a tense situation with police. Who knows? Maybe you coming from this place of love and known love might diffuse something before it happens. You might have a superpower there that nobody else has. So this is what it's about. It's about holding on to our own humanity and not becoming something that you know, coming outside of ourselves, which is what anger and hate will do. It takes you outside of yourself. So it's about holding on to that nonviolence. And that, to me, that nonviolence is about respecting the humanity of the other person, no matter what they're doing, no matter what they believe. Right. So we are all in this together, as hard as it is to remember that.
Thank you so much for that answer. Yeah, again, I mean, the book goes into so much depth on these ideas. I mean, you could underline everything, but then you will have underlined the entire book, which was my problem preparing for the interview because I ended up dogging every single page. So we're about 10 minutes after 7. I want to respect your time and everyone's time. We did get started a little bit late, but if you would indulge me a final answer or a final question. So you have written so many different books in so many different forms and styles and genres. Unforgivable Love is this beautiful retelling and, you know, this romantic, very complicated novel. You've written essay collections, you co-authored a book with Tane. You know, you hear writers say that every book teaches them something new, maybe about themselves or about writing. I would love to hear sort of what lessons maybe or what questions, because that's also what when we learn something, we just have more questions about it, and that's the learning. So maybe what questions have arisen from the writing of this book, or what, you know, what did this book teach you?
You know, it really makes me wonder if I have no idea if I could write something like that again. I really don't know. And it makes me wonder, you know, but because, you know, I'm a trained journalist, right? I have always written for a living, and you sit down and you write, but this book reminds me of, like Stephen King says, like you learn craft and everything, but at the end of the day, what we're really talking about is magic, right? So I feel that there is a certain magic about that book, right? And that I have to respect how certain books are going to come and be their own thing, and I'm not going to have, I may not be able to do that again. Not in that exact same way. It's not like I'm not going to write a great book again, but it's just going to be very different from that book. You mentioned that death chapter, right? And I very much felt that I was coming to something at the end of that book, and I was aiming for a crescendo. This book feels like I'm coming to something, and I want a crescendo here, and it has to end a certain way. And I brought I brought a lot of myself to the fore for that, and can only hope and pray that thing rang in the way that I wanted it to. But it was something that I felt like I aimed high with this book.
Well, it's ringing, and it's continuing to ring. I mean, it's quite the ride when you read the book, because the beginning, it's conversational. The first few chapters are about our relationships to ambition and material objects, and this idea of attaching wealth, value. How do we value ourselves? And so often in our society, it's wealth or possessions, and sort of reconfiguring that. And then suddenly the book just takes off into these complicated, deeply emotional issues. And I keep coming back to that phrase that you write. How do I go about unraveling complicated threads within myself? And to me, that's really defines the approach to the whole book. And it's a model for us all who are writers and essayists. That's what it is, right? We're taking these complicated things and we're unraveling them, and we're not necessarily making them any less complicated, but we're looking at them and taking the time to recognize them.
And yeah, and that also tracks a life, right? So that's kind of what happens with us, mirroring with Merton as a young man. Like there are these basic things that we think about, right? We want to succeed, and we think about having a nice car and nice clothes and things like that. But as we get older, we start to know better. We start being able to see the world in a different way, and we think about what really matters, and we start living our lives in a much more intentional way. So that's why the book changes in the way that it does, because this is the way our lives change.
Yeah, and I love how you talk about that progression of aging and mirroring sort of your own journey as a writer and a mother, and also with Thomas Merton, and how a lot of people, I was really struck by the ending where you share the quote that is often shared by Thomas Merton, which is sort of this, large sweeping quote about death. And you note that people often fail to contextualize that properly, that he wrote that when he was 17. And suffering from an infection. And then in fact, his writings about death much later on have a very different tone to them.
Yes.
Yeah.
When he's 17, he's like, fine, okay, I'm gonna die, right? Just pretty much almost like giving the finger to the world, because he so didn't know how to grasp the fact that he was that sick. But then later, it's like recognizing that he's on a very particular path, and how to prepare for it. How have to acknowledge the fact that I could be gone at any time, because his contemporaries were dying. Back then, in the 50s, the lifespan wasn't exactly the same, but he recognized that, even though he did die young and in an accident, but he recognized that it's something to think about consciously and to prepare for.
Yeah. Oh goodness. I could just go on asking you a million questions. I didn't even get through half my typed questions. But I want to thank you so much, Sophronia, for this beautiful book, and for spending time with us this evening and sharing your thoughts and your process, and you're always so generous with your knowledge and so open with your process. We're all hungry to sort of see what that is, because I think we just want a taste of your brilliance. So thank you so much for sharing that, and thank you to everyone in the webinar. I have been recording it, so what I will do is just upload it to the Pagination YouTube channel, and then we will just share that video on Facebook widely. So
Thank you.
thank you again. And I did want to say that you can order Sophronia's book. It is now out officially. So you can order that. Of course, we always would suggest that you order it from your independent bookstore. So, and if you want to get it at Pagination, of course, we have it linked to in the event page, but we always encourage you to support your local shop. So thank you, Sophronia. This was so wonderful.
It was wonderful.
What a gift to see you. And I am just counting the days until October.
Yes.
Well, thank you all. I appreciate it. And everyone have a lovely and safe evening.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.